If you walk into any modern supermarket, you will see an entire ecosystem built around a single powerful narrative. Protein comes from animals. It comes from shrink-wrapped beef, from cartons of eggs, from gallons of dairy, and, more recently, from massive plastic tubs of industrially processed whey powder. This narrative is so deeply embedded in our culture, our economics, and our agricultural policies that we accept it as an absolute biological truth. We are told that if you want to build muscle, if you want to sustain hard physical labor, or if you want to feed a growing population, you must rely on the industrial meat complex. But this is a modern invention. It is a marketing triumph, not a nutritional necessity. Long before the existence of refrigerated supply chains, concentrated animal feeding operations, and synthetic fertilizers, humanity built some of the greatest, most architecturally advanced civilizations in history, and they did not do it on beef. They did it on highly specialized, biologically engineered plants that delivered extraordinary concentrations of protein. Plants that yielded more nutrition per acre with fewer resources than any cattle ranch on Earth. Today, we are going to examine one specific crop. It is a plant that sustained an empire of 10 million people. It thrives in poor soil, survives freezing altitudes, and requires zero synthetic fertilizer because it makes its own. But most importantly, its seeds contain upward of 45% pure, highly digestible protein by dry weight. Gram for gram, it outperforms beef. Yet, you have almost certainly never eaten it. You will not find it in your local grocery store. It is not grown on American mega farms. This crop was not forgotten because it lacked nutritional value. It was quietly phased out, suppressed, and marginalized for political, cultural, and industrial reasons. It was replaced by a system that prioritizes convenience, mechanization, and profit over human health and ecological sanity. This is the story of the lost protein of the Andes. This is the story of tarwi. By the end of this deep dive, you will understand how the global protein market was monopolized and how reclaiming this forgotten seed could be the ultimate act of food sovereignty. Let us begin by dismantling the great protein myth, the thermodynamics of meat and the protein illusion. To understand why a plant like tarwi was so critical to human history, you first have to understand the fundamental flaw in how we currently produce protein. It is a problem of thermodynamics. In physics, there is a concept called the trophic level. It refers to the position an organism occupies in a food chain. Plants are at the bottom. They are primary producers. They take free solar energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the soil, and they synthesize carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. When a human eats a plant, we get that energy directly. It is highly efficient. But when we rely on beef for protein, we introduce an incredibly inefficient middleman. A cow is a biological machine, and like all machines, it loses energy through heat and metabolism. To produce 1 single pound of beef protein, a cow must consume roughly 10 to 20 pounds of plant protein. The cow burns the vast majority of that energy, just staying alive, walking around, and producing body heat. Only a tiny fraction of the plant protein it eats is converted into muscle tissue that humans can consume. From an ecological and agricultural standpoint, relying on beef as a primary global protein source is mathematically disastrous. It requires vast, unimaginable tracts of land to grow the corn and soy just to feed the cattle. It requires millions of gallons of fresh water. Ancient civilizations did not have the luxury of this inefficiency. They could not afford to waste 10 pounds of grain to get 1 pound of meat. If they were going to build empires, raise armies, and construct monumental architecture, they needed a direct high-density source of fuel. They needed plants that performed like meat. Nowhere was this more critical than in the high Andes Mountains of South America, the empire of the sun and the miracle seed. In the 15th century, the Incan Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, stretched over 2,000 miles along the western coast of South America. It was a civilization of staggering complexity. Without the use of the wheel, without iron tools, and without a written language, they built tens of thousands of miles of paved roads. They constructed cities like Machu Picchu out of massive, perfectly fitted stone blocks at altitudes that leave modern tourists gasping for air. To fuel the millions of laborers, soldiers, and citizens living in this harsh, high-altitude environment, the Incas developed the most advanced agricultural system of the ancient world. They carved massive, stepped terraces called Andes into the sides of steep mountains, creating microclimates that prevented soil erosion and captured solar heat. But the soil at 10,000 feet above sea level is poor. It is rocky, acidic, and lacks nitrogen. Furthermore, the Incas had no large draft animals. They had llamas and alpacas, but these animals were primarily used for wool and transport, not for mass meat production. The Incas needed a crop that could survive freezing temperatures, grow in terrible soil, and provide the massive amounts of protein and fat required for heavy physical labor. They found it in a beautiful, towering plant with vibrant blue and purple flowers. Botanically, it is known as Lupinus mutabilis. The Incas called it tarwi. Tarwi is a species of lupin, a legume, but it is not a normal legume. It is an evolutionary masterpiece. The Incas selectively bred this wild mountain plant over thousands of years to create a biological protein factory. The nutritional supremacy, tarwi versus beef. Let us look at the hard biochemical data. When you purchase a steak at the grocery store, you are buying mostly water. Raw beef is roughly 70% water. When you cook it and remove the moisture, the protein content of that muscle tissue sits at around 25 to 28%. It contains essential amino acids, iron, and a heavy dose of saturated animal fat and cholesterol. Now look at the seed of the tarwi plant. By dry weight, tarwi seeds contain an astonishing 40 to 50% pure protein. Let that sink in. It contains nearly double the protein concentration of conventional meat. It contains more protein than soybeans, more protein than peas, and vastly more protein than staples like wheat or corn. But protein is not just about quantity, it is about quality. Human bodies require 9 essential amino acids, the building blocks of protein that we cannot synthesize ourselves. We must get them from our food. The meat industry has long claimed that only animal products provide complete proteins. This is a manipulation of data. Tarwi possesses a highly impressive amino acid profile. It is incredibly rich in lysine, an essential amino acid that is notoriously deficient in almost all cereal grains. When the Incas ate tarwi alongside maize or quinoa, the combination created a perfect, complete amino acid profile that rivaled any cut of meat on Earth, with an incredibly high bioavailability and digestibility rate. Furthermore, tarwi is not just a protein crop, it is an oil seed. The seeds contain roughly 20% high-quality, unsaturated fat. This includes significant amounts of omega-6 and omega-9 fatty acids, which are critical for cardiovascular health, brain function, and cellular repair. Unlike beef, tarwi contains absolutely zero cholesterol. It is packed with calcium, phosphorus, and iron. It provided the dense, slow-burning caloric energy and the muscle-repairing protein that fueled the expansion of the greatest empire in the Americas. It was, by every nutritional metric, a perfect food, the biological armor in ancient engineering. If tarwi is so incredibly nutritious, why wasn't it eaten by every animal, bird, and insect in the Andes? How did the plant survive in the wild? Nature always extracts a toll. Because the seeds of the tarwi plant are so packed with valuable protein and fat, they are a massive target for predators. To protect its offspring, the tarwi plant evolved a brilliant, toxic defense mechanism. The plant produces chemical compounds called quinolizidine alkaloids, specifically lupinine and spartine. These alkaloids are intensely, unendurably bitter. If a bird or a rodent tries to eat a raw tarwi seed, the extreme bitterness immediately forces them to spit it out. If consumed in large quantities, these alkaloids are toxic to the nervous system. This biological armor allowed tarwi to thrive in the wild without being decimated by pests. The plant naturally repels insects and herbivores. It requires absolutely no chemical pesticides to grow. But this defense mechanism presented a massive problem for human consumption. You cannot eat raw tarwi. The Incas, however, were masterful chemical engineers. They observed that these bitter alkaloids were water-soluble. To make the seeds edible, they developed a precise, large-scale processing method. First, they would boil the harvested seeds in large clay pots. The heat would soften the tough outer seed coat and partially break down the chemical structure of the alkaloids. Next came the genius step. They would place the boiled seeds in woven baskets and submerge them in the fast-flowing, icy rivers of the Andes. They would leave the baskets in the running water for several days. The constant flow of the river would act as a natural solvent, slowly leaching the water-soluble alkaloids out of the seeds and carrying them away. After a few days in the river, the seeds were removed. The toxic bitterness was completely gone. What remained was a sweet, nutty, incredibly dense superfood. The processed tarwi was then eaten fresh in stews, ground into a high-protein flour for baking, or dried and stored for years in the massive stone granaries that fed the Incan armies. They took a poisonous, pest-resistant survival plant and engineered a way to turn it into the protein backbone of their civilization, the conquest and the erasure. If tarwi was this powerful, why did it disappear from the global stage? Why isn't it grown in fields across North America and Europe alongside wheat and corn? The answer has nothing to do with nutrition. It has everything to do with colonialism, cultural erasure, and the imposition of a foreign agricultural system. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, arrived in the Andes. They brought with them gunpowder, steel, and devastating European diseases. The Incan Empire, already fractured by a civil war and ravaged by smallpox, collapsed. The Spanish did not just conquer the people, they conquered the landscape. They viewed the indigenous agricultural systems with suspicion and contempt. The Spanish diet was based on the triad of the Mediterranean: wheat, olive oil, and wine. They brought their own seeds and their own animals: cattle, sheep, and pigs. The Spanish forced the indigenous populations to abandon their traditional crops, to grow wheat and barley, to pay taxes to the crown. The delicate, highly engineered agricultural terraces were trampled and destroyed by the hard hooves of imported European sheep and cattle, causing massive soil erosion. Crops like tarwi, quinoa, and amaranth were systematically marginalized. Because tarwi was central to the indigenous diet, and because it required the traditional river washing process that the Spanish did not understand or care to learn, it was stigmatized. It was labeled as Indian food, peasant food, unfit for European consumption. For nearly 400 years, tarwi was pushed out of the fertile valleys and relegated to the most remote, impoverished, high-altitude villages of the Andes. The knowledge of its cultivation and processing survived only because the indigenous farmers refused to let it die. They kept the seeds hidden, growing them in small, high mountain plots where European crops simply could not survive the frost. The global protein narrative had been rewritten. The Spanish enforced the idea that true, civilized protein came from cattle and sheep. The indigenous miracle seed was buried. The industrial crossroads. Why soy won. Fast forward to the 20th century. Following the devastation of World War II, the global population began to explode. There was a desperate, immediate need for cheap, mass-produced protein. The world needed a legume that could be grown on an industrial scale. By this time, agricultural scientists were fully aware of the nutritional profile of lupins, including tarwi. They knew it contained more protein than almost any other crop. They knew it thrived in poor soil. So why did the global agricultural industry choose the soybean instead? The soybean contains roughly 35 to 38% protein, significantly less than tarwi. It requires massive amounts of water. It is highly susceptible to pests, and it rapidly depletes the soil of nutrients, if not carefully managed. But soy had one massive, overriding advantage. It lacked the bitter alkaloids. Soybeans do not need to be boiled and washed in running rivers for days. They can be harvested by massive combine tractors, shipped directly to a processing plant, crushed, and immediately turned into oil and protein meal. In the 20th century, the agricultural industry was driven by mechanization and convenience, not by ecological sustainability or maximum nutritional density. The industrial supply chain could not handle a crop that required a multi-day, water-leaching debitoring process. It was deemed too complicated, too labor-intensive, and too expensive for the fast-paced, highly mechanized American agricultural machine. Soy won the protein war not because it was the superior plant, but because it fit neatly into the gears of the industrial assembly line. As a result, the world went all in on soy. Today, massive swaths of the Amazon rainforest are slashed and burned to the ground to plant infinite monocultures of soybeans. And the tragic irony? The vast majority of that soy is not grown to feed humans. Over 75% of the global soy crop is processed into feed for industrial livestock pigs, chickens, and cattle. We destroyed an ancient, high-protein plant that humans could eat directly in favor of a lower-protein plant that we feed to animals so that we can eat the animals at a massive thermodynamic loss. It is an agricultural tragedy of epic proportions. The ecological cost and the nitrogen crisis. The marginalization of tarwi did not just cost us a superior food source, it cost us an ecological lifesaver. To understand why, we have to look at how plants grow. All plants require nitrogen. Nitrogen is the fundamental building block of amino acids, which make up protein. You cannot build a high-protein crop without massive amounts of nitrogen in the soil. Modern industrial agriculture, including the cultivation of corn for cattle feed, relies on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. This fertilizer is created using the Haber-Bosch process, an industrial method that pulls nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere, using extreme heat, extreme pressure, and massive amounts of fossil fuels, primarily natural gas. When farmers spray this synthetic nitrogen onto their fields, the plants green up instantly, but the chemical salts destroy the microscopic life in the soil. Worse, when it rains, the water-soluble nitrogen washes out of the root zone, runs into the river systems, and empties into the oceans. This agricultural runoff feeds massive algae blooms that suck all the oxygen out of the water, creating vast, dead zones where no marine life can survive. The modern protein industry, both beef and soy, is entirely dependent on this ecologically devastating, fossil fuel-driven chemical fertilizer. Tarwi does not need it. Like all legumes, tarwi is a nitrogen fixer. But because it evolved in the harsh, nutrient-starved soils of the Andes, it is one of the most aggressive nitrogen fixers on the planet. Tarwi forms a symbiotic relationship with specialized bacteria called rhizobia that live in the soil. The plant grows tiny nodules on its deep taproots. The bacteria move into these nodules. The plant feeds the bacteria sugars, produced through photosynthesis. In return, the bacteria take inert nitrogen gas directly out of the atmosphere, something the plant cannot do itself, and convert it into a usable organic form of nitrogen. The bacteria literally pull free fertilizer out of thin air and pump it directly into the roots of the tarwi plant. This is how the plant builds its massive 45% protein concentration in soils that look like barren rock. When the growing season is over, the tarwi plant leaves the soil richer than it found it. The roots decay, releasing that stored organic nitrogen into the earth, perfectly preparing the field for the next crop. The Incas knew this. They used tarwi as an essential rotational crop, planting it before maize or potatoes to naturally fertilize the soil. We traded a plant that heals the earth and provides its own fertilizer for a system that strips the soil and pollutes the oceans. We traded biological intelligence for chemical dependence, the reemergence, and the sweet breakthrough. For decades, tarwi remained a forgotten relic, grown only by the descendants of the Incas in the high mountains of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But the narrative is beginning to change. In recent years, as the fragility of the global food supply chain has become apparent, and as the ecological devastation of the meat industry can no longer be ignored, agronomists and forward-thinking farmers have begun searching for alternatives. They have begun looking backward to go forward. European and South American scientists are taking a second look at the lupinus family. They are looking at the staggering protein data, the drought tolerance, and the nitrogen-fixing capabilities. They realize that tarwi is the ultimate crop for a changing, unpredictable climate. But the alkaloid problem remained. Modern consumers do not have the time to wash seeds in a river for 4 days. To solve this, botanists have turned to traditional selective breeding, not genetic modification in a lab, but the slow, patient work of selecting seeds. By scouring the Andes and finding rare, naturally occurring genetic mutations of the tarwi plant that produce lower levels of alkaloids, scientists have spent the last few decades breeding sweet tarwi. These new varieties maintain the massive protein density, the deep taproots, and the nitrogen-fixing power, but the seeds have virtually zero bitterness. They can be harvested, cooked, and eaten immediately, just like a soybean or a lentil. The industrial barrier has been removed. Today, small-scale regenerative farmers are beginning to cultivate these sweet lupin varieties. Artisanal food producers are turning the protein-dense seeds into flour, dairy-free milks, and plant-based protein isolates that far exceed the nutritional quality of highly processed soy or whey. The path forward, reclaiming food sovereignty. The story of tarwi is a warning, but it is also an invitation. It is a warning that the food available in our modern supermarkets is not there because it is the most nutritious, the most sustainable, or the most beneficial for human health. It is there because it is the most profitable for a highly consolidated, mechanized industrial system. The phasing out of tarwi was a triumph of corporate convenience over biological excellence, but it is an invitation to reclaim our food sovereignty. We do not have to be passive consumers in a broken system. We do not have to rely on a massive, fragile supply chain that ships chemical-laden soy across the ocean to feed cattle in feedlots. The knowledge of the ancient world has not been entirely lost. The seeds still exist. Understanding the history of crops like tarwi changes the way you look at a plate of food. It reveals the invisible architecture of agriculture, economics, and history that determines what we eat. The future of food security is not going to be found in synthetic meat, grown in a sterile laboratory. And it is not going to be found in doubling down on the chemical destruction of our topsoil. The future of true, sustainable resilience is going to be found in remembering what we have forgotten. It is going to be found in the seeds that survived empires. If you are ready to stop accepting the narrative you have been sold by the industrial food complex, if you are ready to explore the plants that can actually heal your body and the soil simultaneously, then the journey has just begun.